He thought he'd lost his son forever, and on a bitter, snowy Christmas Eve, it felt as if the world agreed. Snow feathered down in slow curtains outside the restaurant windows, catching the light from antique street lamps and turning the street into a stage. Inside, candles burned low, voices softened, and someone somewhere played a quietly familiar carol on a piano. Daniel Foster stood by the doorway in a coat that had seen better winters. He had his son's small wrapped present tucked under his arm, a tin robot with a slightly bent antenna he'd found in a thrift store, and a knot in his chest that felt older than the year he'd been without Sarah. He had agreed to a blind date because his friend Eddie insisted it would be good for him to go out, to sit with strangers and try to remember how to be more than a father wrangled by grief. He had said yes, not because he wanted romance, but because there was a small, practical hope in him that some companionship might ease the edges of a life that had, lately, been all routine and appointments and dinners with cartoons on for one. The woman waiting at the table had been well-dressed, precise in a way that made Daniel feel like a handyman on a stage he'd never rehearsed. Conversation began thin, polite. She asked about work, about hobbies. He mentioned fixing leaky faucets, installing shelves, the small satisfaction of seeing a job done. He told her about Alec, that was his son's name, about how he painted spaceships with sidewalk chalk and could name every dinosaur he'd seen in a picture book. There was a point when he hesitated, the mention of Sarah like a brief eclipse. He offered a measured answer about the accident, careful not to let the room tilt toward pity. It didn't land the way he'd hoped. The woman glanced at him as if deciding which shelf he belonged on, and then, without cruelty, but with a conviction that felt like a verdict, said she didn't think they were on the same track. She had plans, she explained, a certain life filled with certain people, and it was better not to continue. They parted with the stiff grace of strangers at crossroads. Daniel smiled because he did not want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. He gathered his coat, the small tin robot, and the cold hum in his bones, and he slipped out into the street. Outside, the snow sounded softer than the finality of her words. He sent a text to Alec. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Big hug." He put the phone in his pocket and leaned against the cold glass of the restaurant's front. For a bare minute, the thought that had been a dull, persistent ache, that after Sarah's funeral, after the months when her parents had taken Alec in to help while he bled through paperwork and grief, after those easy weeks when he'd stayed with his in-laws while he found his footing and slowly rebuilt, it all condensed into a single fear. What if the gap had become a chasm? What if time, distance, and the idea of a better situation had taken Alec away in ways he couldn't reverse? He'd told himself it was irrational. The legal papers had been quiet. There had been no orders or threats. Still, fatherhood had become a thing he carried lightly, afraid of dropping it. He thought of the thinned lines in Alec's handwriting when he'd last seen him, how a boy's hand can hold a map of longing, and he felt suddenly small under the town's blinking lights. If you believe in second chances, stay with this story. Daniel did not shout or beg. He walked down the street, boots making soft prints, and considered calling Eddie, but pride made his fingers stay in his pocket. He stopped before a shop window and watched his breath fog the pane. The restaurant's warm glow wrapped itself around a family laughing, a server setting a child's place with a paper hat. The world inside was moving in rhythms he could not join tonight. She saw him before he saw her. Clara Whitmore slowed long enough to notice the man in the doorway and the way he walked away alone. She had been in town for a family engagement, the kind that summoned her name in printed columns and made polite people behave with a tiny bit more caution around her. She actually carried a burden, an exhaustion from being constantly observed, from having her choices catalogued as if her life were a series of transactions to be appraised. That evening, she had worn something deliberately plain, a coat without the family crest, a scarf knitted by someone anonymous. It helped her breathe, a little. Clara watched Daniel move through the snow with the wrapped toy under his arm. In him, she recognized something she had longed for among the very public wins and private losses, an ordinary kindness that cost nothing and was worth everything. She crossed the street. "Excuse me," she said, standing by his shoulder, her voice a neutral tone chosen to be neither patronizing nor presumptuous. "Do you mind if I walk with you for a minute?" He nodded, surprised at the company. The two of them moved under a marquee of white lights. Snow softened the edges of the world, muffling the clatter of the city. Clara did not ask intrusive questions. She offered conversation as if handing him an unlit candle, something to hold, something to warm his hand. They ended up at the only open corner bistro, the kind of place that kept a portion of its tables empty for people who needed to step into the heat for a few minutes. She insisted on paying, and in the quiet way she did everything, decisively but without fanfare, she sat across from him and asked him to tell her about Alec. He did, because the name loosened him. He spoke of toy dinosaurs, of a persistent habit of insisting the moon was a nightlight, of a laugh that came out like a small motorcycle revving up. "I was supposed to be home by then," he confessed at one point. "After Sarah, her parents said they could keep him for a while to make sure he had stability. I thought I'd get my bearings, then take him back. Sometimes I wake up and worry that for a while has stretched into forever." She listened. She did not offer platitudes. She told him about a childhood when people assumed she was nervous or calculating simply because she easily owned things that had once been impossible for her mother. She spoke about the loneliness that can come from having plenty but not having honest laughter. Her voice did not aim to fix him. It aimed to be present. "Would you like company tonight?" she asked. "You don't have to be alone in the snow." There was no dramatic musical swell, no unstated cosmic arrangement. There was only a decision, small and human, to sit, to eat, to talk. Daniel accepted. They made room for each other's quiet confessions, trading grief and hope like small silverware on a table, practical, simple, necessary. The night changed in simple increments. They found a rhythm of honesty. When Clara pressed him about pride, he admitted the truth, that he feared being seen as less than because of his scruffed hands and odd hours. When Daniel asked why she reached out, Clara said plainly that she admired the way he handled the rejection, not with arrogance or self-pity, but with dignity. "There's a difference between being defeated and being steady," she said, and he found himself lifting his shoulders as if loosening an old harness. They parted with a handshake that felt like a promise to talk again, and in the days that followed, they did. 2 weeks spread themselves like a warm quilt over the town. Coffee dates that turned into shared lunches, walks where they traded stories about their childhoods, evenings when they watched Alec's favorite cartoons on the couch while he sat beside them as if the space had always been available. Clara asked for nothing but time, and she gave time in a way that did not come across as charity. What made their intimacy believable was not the speed at which it happened, but the depth of attention. Clara met the boy with a gentle frankness. She knelt to his height and let her tell her at length about the incredible feats of his tin robot. She did not comment on his clothing or his toothbrush. She listened to the world through his small, earnest voice. Alec gave her a broken plastic keychain at once, pleased to offer something of his own. That offering mattered more than anything she might have bought. Word, of course, found its way beyond the small circles of their table. A local blog ran a piece about Clara's new companion, and before long the town's more curious residents had opinions. The Whitmore family, largely protective of their name and concerned about appearances, watched with a particular intensity. Some family members worried about the optics of a wealthy heiress choosing a man who didn't match the expected image of someone who would move comfortably among society pages. A cousin implied that he could do better. A relative wrote that a simple life lacked refinement. Behind the polite inquiries and public posturing, there was a strain of judgment that could become a small avalanche if left unchecked. Clara, for all her upbringing, responded not with defiance, but with choices that told the story more clearly than any argument could. She canceled a charity gala speech when she realized she would be asked where she stood on the right kind of partner. She spent an hour on a weekday rearranging her own calendar to be present at Alec's classroom holiday performance, sitting in the back with a scarf around her neck and a program in her lap. She invited Daniel to dinners that were private, where talk of family and safety and future plans felt natural rather than interrogatory. People asked if the money changed things. Daniel sometimes felt a flare of shame at the question, as if he were supposed to feel grateful in a malformed way. He had grown used to explaining himself, to calibrating his answers to the tone of a room. Clara never asked him to explain. She never subtitled his value by the size of her bank account. Instead, she introduced him to people as "my friend Daniel," and then later as "the man I love," slowly shifting the pronouns as naturally as seasons change. Not all reactions were hostile. Eddie was delighted and cautious at once, congratulating Daniel while reminding him to be himself. Alec watched the exchanges with the kind of curiosity only a child has. He was happy when Daniel and Clara sat on the floor and built block towers together. The grandparents who had taken Alec in, mostly kind people who had the tendency to worry for the safety of the small, observed these developments with folded hands, balancing their desire for the boy's stability with their recognition that his father was trying, and had always tried, to be present. The moment that felt the most like a test came at a small holiday gathering at the Whitmore estate. It had been Clara's choice to invite the family, to make their relationship official, if not in the eyes of every social camera in town, then at least in the presence of those who had known her most intimately. Daniel arrived with a nervousness he could never fully disguise. He was conscious of the glossy portraits, the fine silver, the way footsteps in marble conversations were softer than the ones he took in the hardware store. Conversation flowed around him. Polite barbs about markets, a cousin's attempt at witty skepticism about a man who worked with his hands. Daniel listened and replied with the same honesty he offered at the bistro. He did not inflate himself. Clara watched him with a steady calm, and when someone stepped over a line, she stood and said, without drama, that Daniel would be treated with respect. The room paused, as if a conductor had lifted a baton. Later that evening, Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway, feeling like an intruder in his own life. Clara crossed the room and put her hand on his arm. "You don't need their permission," she said. "You need your son. You need to know you can stand up to the small voices." He wanted to believe her, but old fears are patient, and he had a way of folding them into every quiet night. "What if I'm fooling myself?" he asked. "What if I'm not enough?" "You are more than enough," she answered simply. "And I'm not choosing you out of pity or curiosity. I'm choosing you because I see who you are." How do you prove that kind of thing? Over weeks, it manifested in small, steady acts. Clara learned to change a diaper in an emergency, though she never pretended she had decades of experience. Daniel learned to accept help, a little at a time, without measuring it as either gift or insult. The boy began to sleep in Daniel's bed more nights than not. The grandparents visited, brought pies, and left with the lightness of people who had been reassured. There was also the press. A local reporter got wind of the heiress and the handyman angle and wrote a piece that invited readers to imagine scandal where there was none. Clara's family received calls from old friends suggesting she might be making an error. For a brief time, it felt like a storm winded toward them. But Clara, having lived under public scrutiny her entire life, knew better than to let the wind decide her weather. She put a clear, quiet announcement on her social account. She would not be entertaining commentary on her personal life from strangers. It was not a theatrical shutdown. It was a line drawn around what she would allow into their home. For Daniel, the steadying came from the simplest of things. Alec calling his name across the room. The boy falling asleep curled against him after a night of reading. the tin robot's bent antenna catching the morning light on Daniel's kitchen counter. The fear that, for a while, had become forever, loosened as the boy increasingly chose the small rituals of living with him. There was, however, a lingering legal formality they could not dodge, paperwork that required the grandparents and Daniel to sign something that made Alex's living arrangement clear. It was not an adversarial court drama, it was a quiet affirmation of what they had been building, made official so no one could later doubt who provided care. On a clear December evening, a modest family attorney sat at Daniel's small kitchen table with a folder of documents. The grandparents sat across, their faces lined with concern that had softened over months of observation. Alex sat on Daniel's lap, legs swinging. There were signatures, there were smiles. There were, for both men, honest tears that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with relief. "Home is where he wants to be," the grandmother said, voice small. "You've done well, Daniel. He's happy here." "That's all I wanted," Daniel said, fingers wandering to the tin robot. He had spent months convincing himself a legal piece of paper would not soothe everything, and yet holding the signed page felt like a cleared path. It did not erase the nights when he woke and the ache was loud, but it narrowed the space where fear had been permitted to live. The real heart of the story, though, belonged to a smaller, quieter moment. It happened on Christmas Eve, the second one after Sarah's funeral. The night was the kind of cold that held its breath until a bell rang. Daniel had wrapped Alex's tin robot anew, though the tape stayed crooked. He had made a small attempt at decorations, a string of lights over the window. Clara arrived with a scarf and a thermos of hot chocolate, and that evening they all sat together on a couch that had once been two separate pieces. Midway through the evening, there was a knock at the door. Daniel opened it to find Alex's grandparents standing there, the grandmother holding a small envelope. They looked at the family on the couch with an expression that could have been mistaken for sorrow if one were not looking closely. It was instead a mixture of respect and something like pride. "We stopped by to bring this," she said, handing over the envelope. Inside was a card with a photograph dated a decade earlier. Sarah, young and laughing, holding a single paper star in her hand. On the back she'd written in a tidy hand, "For Daniel and Alec, always follow the light." "We wanted you to have this," the grandfather added. "We made sure he had time with us when he needed it, but seeing him here, with you, tonight, we wanted to give him back, if you will. Not because we could keep him, but because we wanted you to know we trust you." Alec ran to Daniel and threw his arms around him, breath hot against the winter air. The house smelled of cocoa and the faint trace of pine. Daniel felt something inside fold into a different shape, an old fear dissolving like the first crust of ice on a thawing pond. It was nothing theatrical, just a man and a boy and two sets of people who had, imperfectly and with love, decided to come together. Christmas morning they took a picture on the porch, shoes crunching in the snow. Clara stood beside Daniel, her hand resting on his back the way one might steady a boat in a harbor. Alex squeezed between them, tin robot clenched triumphantly. In the photo, everyone's cheeks were rosy, their smiles a little raw from the cold. The photograph later found a place on the mantel, near a small plaque that read, not in flowery script, but in plain, deliberate lettering, "Christmas Eve, when we came home." The usually private Whitmore family gathered for an intimate blessing, not a ceremony for headlines, but a sharing of intentions. Clara addressed her relatives with the same quiet authority she used when she stood up for a principle. "We are choosing Daniel," she said, "not because of what he doesn't have, but because of who he is. I expect everyone to respect that." There were varied responses. Some relatives obliged, others took longer. That, too, was part of the story. Real life does not ask permission to change, and those around you may need time to catch up. The point was not to win every heart immediately, but to decide, as a unit, who would be inside the circle. As spring edged toward the year that followed, the public interest dwindled. People who had once speculated moved on to other curiosities. The family found a new pattern: Saturday mornings of pancakes when they allowed themselves the luxury of flipping eggs together. Evenings when the three of them crowded into a small car for errands and laughed at the goofy music blaring from the radio. Quiet Tuesdays when Daniel worked on a neighbor's fence and Clara arranged meetings with local charities she cared about, bringing him along when invitations felt sincere rather than performative. Not everything was easy. Daniel woke some nights with a grief that felt large and hungry. There were occasional arguments, small human things, about how to handle chores, how to manage finances, which cartoon to watch. But those moments, rather than the other way around, were proof that this family was, in fact, a family, not because it was perfect, but because it was willing to show the edges and work around them. The choice to propose came not from a single brilliant inspiration, but an accumulation of little real decisions. It happened under a streetlight dusted with snow, the kind of ordinary magic that was never meant to be publicized. Clara took his hand, and for a moment they both stood looking at the same quiet patch of sky. "I can't promise you I know everything," she said. "I can't promise that life won't hurt, but I can promise I will choose this, you, him, every day. Will you choose me?" Daniel listened. There were reasons he could list for why he might say no: the weight of fear, the awkwardness of merging lives, the memory of loss that sometimes sat at his shoulder like a wary dog. But the reasons to say yes were louder, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. He had found a woman who saw him, who loved his son as if he were her own without being asked, who had already made choices that proved the feeling. He had a son who had learned how to offer his small, earnest affection in the form of a broken keychain. He had a life that, despite its ragged edges, was steady. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I choose you." The ring was modest, not because she couldn't afford something grand, but because neither one of them wanted a spectacle. It fit. It was simple and honest, much like everything else that had come to be between them. The wedding, a few months later, was small and suited them. Winter white, a handful of friends, a few family members who had come around. Alex spilled some punch on his sleeve and laughed, and nobody made a fuss. They wrote their vows not as promises to change each other, but as promises to be present for the small tasks, to clear dishes, to pick up socks, to forgive errant moods. They spoke of choosing each other on purpose, of the dignity of standing together in public and private. After the ceremony, the grandparents came up and hugged Daniel. "You kept faith with him," the grandmother whispered, as if naming a sacred job. It was less a comment on religion than on reliability, a primal human recognition that he had navigated sorrow and come out on the other side with his son intact, their bond not broken but strengthened. The story that began on a winter night with a rejected man in a doorway ended not with an exclamation but with a picture. Their three faces, framed by a small wreath on the wall. Underneath the frame, someone had written a date in neat handwriting, and beneath it, a single line: "We were found here." Clara never used her wealth to erase Daniel's past. She used it to smooth some rough edges, sure, to fix a roof dented by storms, to pay for a tutoring class Alec enjoyed, but always with an eye toward preserving dignity. She resisted the temptation to turn problems into purchases. Instead, she modeled something more difficult: vulnerability paired with decisive action. She defended him when needed and stepped back when he simply needed space. She chose family over approval. Her choice to stand with Daniel was a moral act that had ripples beyond publicity. For Daniel, the gift was not merely an ending of a fear, it was the redefinition of fatherhood. He had learned to let someone in without reading it as abandonment of his son's needs, and in allowing Clara to love them, he found that his son had not been lost at all. Alec had been with other people who loved him, but his heart had not been relocated. It had merely been waiting for the place he most wanted to be. Years later, when people asked Daniel about that night on the street, he would tell the story without sentimentality and without grand claims about fate. He would say that he had been rejected and that he had been seen. He would say that a woman who could have been any number of things chose to be a person who noticed. He would tell them that the rest was small decisions and courage, showing up, signing papers, forgiving small slights, making pancakes, apologizing when necessary. The photograph on the mantel remained. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, Daniel would sit with it in his hands as if it were a compass. He would look at the bent antenna of Alec's old toy and remember the way the boy had sworn it could still signal to distant worlds. He would remember the cold, and how Clara had crossed the street, and how the grandparents had returned a boy to the home where he belonged. He never called it a miracle the way a sermon might call one. He called it luck at times, and the right timing at others, and sometimes, simply, a string of kind decisions. He felt grateful. Gratitude in his chest was a quiet thing that made him careful with the people he loved. On another Christmas Eve, a small plaque appeared beneath the photograph on the mantel. It read, in plain type, "When dignity met kindness, a home was found." It was a phrase they used to explain what had happened without making the story larger than it was. Not supernatural, not triumphant in the way news headlines promise, just real. A man who had been gentle in the face of humiliation, a woman who saw him and chose to act, a child who came home. If you believe Christmas brings second chances, subscribe and share this story.